In this presentation, I'll summarize progress in decoding the symbols at Gobekli Tepe, and I'll explain how they reveal early developments in astronomy, arithmetic, and proto-writing. And I'll draw heavily from these two papers from 2017 and 2024, where we decoded the likely meaning of many of the symbols at Gobekli Tepe. Now, specifically in the 2017 paper, we explained how Pillar 43, which is one of many stone pillars at Gobekli Tepe, can be viewed as a memorial to the Younger Dryas impact event. So the theme of this pillar is remembrance, I suggest. Now, the Younger Dryas impact event is when it's thought that multiple fragments of a broken comet impacted with Earth at around 10,850 BC. And this is thought to have been a massive catastrophe distributed across one side or hemisphere of Earth, mainly affecting North America, but also impacting South America and Europe through to the Middle East. So here is Gobekli Tepe in southern Turkey, just north of Syria. It sits at the heart of the ancient Fertile Crescent. It's at least 11,500 years old, and it's thought by many to have played an important role in the development of civilization at the very beginning of the Neolithic period. Now, Gobekli Tepe sits on top of a hill overlooking the Haran Plain to the south, so it's an excellent place for naked eye astronomy, and that's crucial for our interpretation of Gobekli Tepe symbols. So this is what the excavation site looked like a few years ago when I visited, and you can see it's very big. But the four main excavated enclosures in this video are just a small part of the ancient site. The rest of the site, revealed by ground-penetrating radar, is much larger again, and probably there are many more large enclosures like these remaining to be excavated. Now, this is a detailed map of the excavations around enclosure D, which contains Pillar 43. And it shows the different phases of construction of these enclosures, because they were built and rebuilt many times. Now, the oldest radiocarbon dates so far published correspond to this section of war here, where Pillar 43 is located, and a hearth at about this point outside of enclosure D, close to bedrock, and they date to around 9,530 BC with an uncertainty of 200 years or so. But this dark blue section of wall at the south of enclosure D is thought to be even older. So it's possible that this enclosure dates to well before 9,600 BC, which means Gobekli Tepe could be a Paleolithic construction. Okay, so that was a brief introduction to Gobekli Tepe. So now let's look at some of the symbols on Pillar 18 in enclosure D. So that's the same enclosure which has Pillar 43. Now, Pillar 18 is one of two very tall, over 5 meter tall pillars that stand near the middle of enclosure D. And let's compare the front of enclosure D, of Pillar 18, with the Nebra sky disk. Now, the Nebra sky disk is a Bronze or Iron Age artifact from Europe that's got nothing to do with Gobekli Tepe directly, but it's widely considered to show astronomical symbols. So we can see what are obviously the sun and the moon. And here we have 7 dots, which are widely recognized as symbolizing the Pleiades star cluster. And here we have a curved streak, which might symbolize a comet. And if we look again at the front of Pillar 18, at Gobekli, we have what appear to be the sun and the moon at the top of the pillar. And here we have 7 birds at the base of the pillar. And in widespread myths, the Pleiades are often represented either by 6 or 7 sisters or birds. And here we have a belt buckle and loincloth that look somewhat like the head and tail of a comet. And this was already suggested by Andrew Collins in 2014. So Pillar 18 has some similarities to the Nebra sky disk, which is accepted to show astronomical symbols. So perhaps the front of Pillar 18 also shows astronomical symbols. Okay, so now let's go back to Pillar 43, which is the focus of this presentation. And clearly this disk on Pillar 43 could have the same meaning as this disk on Pillar 18, although this one seems to have a hole in it, which presumably has some additional meaning. So it's reasonable to propose that this disk on pillar 43 might also symbolize the sun, and therefore it's possible that these animal constellations might be constellation symbols. Now this should not be very surprising. It's frequently argued by the site's excavators that the symbolism at Gobekli Tepe is consistent with shamanism. But there are well-established associations between shamanism and astronomy, and see Ed Krupp's book, for example. And moreover, Hayden and Villeneuve make a compelling argument that many complex hunter-gatherers, even in the Paleolithic period, tracked the solstices and equinoxes. And the people who built Enclosure D were probably complex hunter-gatherers. So if this is the sun, then we should not be too surprised to find symbolism for the solstices and equinoxes as well. And that's how we interpret these four symbols. So as solstice and equinox markers. So the disk here, that's, we think, stands for the summer solstice. And then the three half disks at the top here are interpreted as the other three solstices, equinoxes of the year. And therefore these animal symbols that stand next to them are likely the zodiacal constellations next to the sun at those times. So now let's consider deep time connections between constellations, animal symbols, and myth. So there are now several papers, like this small selection here, that make the case for a deep time connection between constellations, animal symbols, and myth. And they make these claims based on analysis of widely dispersed myths from all across the world. And especially we see the Pleiades are often symbolized in terms of 6 or 7 sisters or birds, just as we saw at the bottom of pillar 18. And due to these similarities of these stories across the whole world, it's thought that some of these stories might be older even than 50,000 years. So they could be incredibly old, and yet they have survived until today. Now let's move forward in time to Bronze Age Mesopotamia, so thousands of years after Gobekli Tepe, and we find in the historical Babylonian texts the names of at least 46 constellations. And most of those names are Sumerian, which means they likely date to the previous millennium or two, which means they could date back to the 4th millennium BC. And we also know from these texts that these constellation names are mostly the names of animals, mythological characters, and deities. Now let's move to Bronze Age Egypt, and we find a similar pattern. We know their deities were associated with zodiac-like animals, and we know their religion was strongly related to astronomy, although we don't have a record of their pre-dynastic constellations. Nevertheless, in Egypt too, we see the association of astronomy, religion, and animal symbols. So we can say that even in Paleolithic times across the world, long before Gobekli Tepe, and in the Bronze Age Fertile Crescent, long after Gobekli Tepe, there are strong links between constellations, animal symbols, and myth. So now Gobekli Tepe is thought to be a cultic center, where the animal symbols likely represent mythological creatures. So it's reasonable to propose they could also be constellation symbols, especially when we see them next to these geometric symbols, which might symbolize the sun. But the strongest evidence that this is indeed the correct interpretation for these symbols is the apparent correlation between what we see on pillar 43 and what we expect to see if our hypothesis is correct. And this was the main subject of my 2017 paper with Dimitrios Sakritsis. So what is this strong correlation? Well, we thought that the bird of prey was a good match to the teapot asterism of the Greek Sagittarius constellation, which is drawn in yellow here. And this correlation was already suggested previously by Paul Burley, an archaeologist, in 2014. And using some archaeoastronomical software, it's easy to see that on the summer solstice, the position of the sun relative to the teapot asterism corresponds to about 10,950 BC, to within a few hundred years, which is close to the suggested date of the Younger Dryas impact event. So if this bird of prey does indeed symbolize the teapot part of Sagittarius as it sets on the western horizon, then we can expect Scorpius to be directly below it. And we do actually see a scorpion exactly where we expect. And also we expect to see Lupus, the mad dog or wolf, just to the left of the scorpion. And indeed we find a canid figure exactly in the right position and pose on pillar 43. So this is already a very good match. And again, if our hypothesis is right, we expect to see Ophiuchus struggling with his giant serpent over here. What we find instead is a tall bird struggling with a snake. So that's a partial match. And then if our hypothesis is correct, we expect to see Pisces next to the sun on the autumn equinox. And indeed, the shape of this bending bird very closely matches our Pisces constellation. And then in the middle, we expect to find Gemini next to the sun on the winter solstice. Now we know Gemini as the twins, which in terms of an animal would be seen as a standing quadruped viewed from the side. And that's exactly what we see here. And then on the right, we expect to see Virgo next to the sun on the spring equinox, which again, in terms of an animal, can be viewed as a vertically oriented, splayed quadruped, and that's exactly what we see here. Now, a few of these individual correlations could be coincidence, but when they appear all together, it's a very strong indication that we've got this correct. Now we are in a position to discuss the possibility of a solar calendar on pillar 43, and that was the main subject of my 2024 paper. So let's take a look at these geometric symbols here. If you count them carefully, you'll see there are 14 double V's with alternating vertical orientation in this top row with a single V at the end. Now, John Gordon, a psychologist, suggests that this is counting the days of a lunar cycle, and I agree, and here's how. So if you count the upright V's, you'll count 15 right to left and then 15 back again, and that makes 30. But if you count the 15 upright V's right to left and the 14 upside down V's back again, you'll get 29. Now the lunar cycle alternates nearly perfectly between 29 and 30 days. Underneath that, we have 11 little boxes. And if we take each box to mean repeat the above count, then we have 11 more lunar cycles, which totals 354 days. But underneath those boxes, we have 10 more V symbols. So if we add them to the count, we have 364 days, which is just one short of an entire solar year. So we have a day missing. But look how this pattern seems to be focusing down onto this disk symbol. I suggest this is a deliberate design, and it's telling us the sun disk, or this disk, represents the final day, the 365th day in the count, which we take to be the summer solstice. So why is this geometric design here? What's its purpose on this pillar? I suggest the whole point of this design is simply to tell us that this disk represents the sun on a special day in the year, presumably the summer solstice, and therefore this scene could be a date written using precession of the equinoxes. And of course that story dovetails perfectly with our 2017 paper, which suggested exactly that this scene is a date using precession. Now, to my knowledge, this solar calendar, which is very obvious, is the earliest evidence for arithmetic yet discovered, and we can convert these symbols to this arithmetic expression which counts the days in a year. Now let's look at a different pillar at Gobekli Tepe. Let's look at pillar 33, which is also an enclosure D. So here we can see a bunch of snakes leaping or radiating from the legs and torso of a fox. And on the other side of the pillar is a similar scene where the snakes are projecting from the legs and torso of a tall bending bird. So what should we make of this? Well, if the animal symbols represent constellation, which pillar 43 tells us is highly likely, then these snakes almost certainly symbolize meteors. So these are probably very nice pictures of a meteor stream. But which one? Well, we've already decoded the tall bending bird here as it appears at the top left of pillar 43, where it symbolizes a constellation similar to Pisces. And the fox on the other side of the pillar is very similar to the northern part of Aquarius. Now we expect that the Taurid meteor stream, at the time Gobekli was occupied, would have radiated from the directions of Aquarius and then Pisces over the course of several weeks. So this pillar could be a very nice picture of the Taurid meteor stream, the same meteor stream that is blamed for the Younger Dryas impact. Now you'll see the snakes converge on the inner narrow face of this pillar, and here is a sketch. And these V symbols are telling us, or are these V symbols telling us, the duration of the Taurid meteor stream, so 13 days from the direction of Aquarius and 14 days from the direction of Pisces. That would make sense. Okay, so to summarize, we've seen that pillar 18 at the center of enclosure D strongly hints that much of the symbolism at Gobekli Tepe could be astronomical. And then we saw how pillar 43 likely encodes a date using precession of the equinoxes and constellation symbols that appear to be precursors to the Greek constellations. And we saw that the solar calendar on pillar 43 is clear evidence of early arithmetic and that it strongly supports this astronomical interpretation. And then we saw how pillar 33 could be recording the duration and path of the Taurid meteor stream, about 27 days from the directions of Aquarius and then Pisces. So when we put it all together with this headless man at the bottom of pillar 43, which surely signifies death, these symbols seem to be a kind of proto-writing that is telling us a story of a great disaster that struck Earth near the onset of the Younger Dryas cooling. And possibly it was this terrifying comet impact event that inspired them, these people, to develop a new kind of religion, which in turn led them to build this place and others like it nearby and to settle down to a new way of life. And I'll finish there. Thank you.